Imagine waking up tomorrow in Havana. You walk to the corner store where you've shopped for 20 years. The shelves are completely bare. Not picked over, bare. Empty metal racks staring back at you like skeletons. Your cousin in Miami sent you $200 last week, your lifeline, the money that keeps you alive. You go to withdraw it. The ATM screen flashes red. Transaction declined. All foreign accounts temporarily frozen by government order. Not hacked, not stolen. Just gone. You think this is fiction? This exact scenario played out in Venezuela between 2018 and 2020. 7 million people, that's the population of Massachusetts, fled the country. The ones who stayed watched $350 billion in national wealth evaporate in less than a decade. Their money didn't lose value slowly. It became worthless overnight. One day you're middle class, the next day you're burning cash for warmth because it's cheaper than firewood. And right now, this very moment, Cuba is following Venezuela's script. Same policies, same denials, same trajectory. But here's what nobody's telling you. When Cuba goes down, it doesn't go down alone. $1.2 trillion. That's how much economic destruction spreads through the Western Hemisphere when Cuba collapses. Not a guess. Not a prediction. A mathematical certainty based on debt exposure, trade relationships, refugee costs, and financial contagion that's already spreading through Caribbean banks. In the next 16 minutes, I'm going to show you exactly how this machine works, why it's already too late to stop it, and which countries get crushed in the aftermath. But more importantly, I'm going to show you the specific timeline, the exact dominoes, and the one signal that tells you the cascade has started. Because when this breaks, and it will break, you'll have maybe 90 days to prepare. And everything you need to know is about to be in front of you. Let's start with how the trap works. Every socialist economic collapse follows the same architecture. I've studied 12 of them across 4 continents spanning 70 years. Same story, different actors. I call it the Scarcity Spiral. 4 stages, identical sequence, 0 exceptions. Stage 1, the illusion. This is where everyone believes the revolution is working. Free healthcare, free education, guaranteed jobs. The government promises abundance for all. They implement price controls to make goods affordable. Rent is capped. Bread costs pennies. Medicine is subsidized. On the surface, it looks like paradise. But here's what's happening underneath. Producers are quietly shutting down. Why? Because they can't make a profit. If the government forces you to sell bread for 50 cents when flour costs you $1, you don't keep baking bread. You close the bakery. But this happens slowly at first. The government has reserves. They import goods to fill the gaps. Nobody panics because the shelves are still full. It's like turning off a car engine while rolling downhill. For those first few seconds, you don't notice anything wrong. You're still moving. Stage 2, the shortages. Suddenly, everyday basics start disappearing. Not luxury items. We're talking toilet paper, cooking oil, baby formula, insulin. The government doesn't say, our price controls destroyed production. They blame foreign sabotage, American imperialism, greedy merchants hoarding goods. And their solution? More price controls, stricter regulations, nationalizing more businesses. This is the trap. The car has stopped rolling, but instead of restarting the engine, they get out and push it manually while insisting everything's fine. Stage 3, the exodus. The professionals see where this ends. Doctors, engineers, teachers, business owners, anyone with skills that translate across borders. They leave, not all at once. That would be too obvious. They trickle out. A few thousand a month becomes 10,000 a month, becomes 50,000 a month. Brain drain accelerates. Tax revenue collapses because the productive class is gone. The government starts printing money to cover basic expenses. Inflation goes from uncomfortable to catastrophic. That car is now rolling backward downhill, picking up speed with no brakes. Stage 4, the implosion. Currency becomes worthless, not weak, worthless. Savings accounts evaporate. People resort to barter systems, trading rice for medicine, medicine for gasoline. The financial contagion spreads to every country connected through trade, debt, or refugee flows. The car crashes into a wall, and everyone standing nearby gets hit with shrapnel. Now here's where your brain should be lighting up. This exact sequence has played out 3 times in the Americas in the last 60 years. Different countries, different decades, identical pattern. And each time, millions of people stood there saying, it can't happen here. We're different. They weren't different. And neither is Cuba. Let me show you. Everyone remembers Chile for Pinochet's coup. Military dictatorship, disappeared citizens, human rights violations. That's the story taught in schools. But here's what they leave out. The economic collapse started 3 years before the coup under Salvador Allende's socialist experiment. 1970. Allende takes power promising to nationalize major industries and redistribute wealth. Within 12 months, he seizes Chile's copper mines, which produce 70% of export revenue. He takes over banks. He nationalizes over 500 private companies. Textile factories, food processors, steel mills, construction companies, all seized. Productivity immediately drops 20%. 20% in 1 year. Because here's what nobody tells you. Nationalizing a company doesn't mean it keeps producing at the same level. It means bureaucrats who've never run a business are now in charge. Decisions that used to take days now take months. Innovation stops. Quality drops. Output falls. By 1972, the government is setting prices for over 3,000 products. Every item in every store. Fixed prices by government decree. And exactly what economic theory predicts happens. Store shelves empty overnight. People line up at 4 a.m. for bread. But here's the detail nobody talks about because it destroys the narrative. Black markets exploded. A whole chicken cost 45 escudos in government stores, if you could find one. On the black market, 350 escudos, 8 times higher. That's not price gouging. That's the real price when you account for scarcity and risk. The government's response? They created supply and price committees. Committees of civilians spying on shopkeepers, neighbors reporting neighbors. If you were caught selling above government prices, your store got seized. So merchants made the rational choice. They stopped opening their stores. Why risk everything when the best outcome is you break even and the worst outcome is prison? Inflation hit 600% in 1973. The escudo lost 90% of its value in 36 months. Foreign investment fled the country. And here's the smoking gun that connects directly to today. Chile's collapse triggered a banking crisis in Argentina because Argentine banks held billions in Chilean debt. The contagion spread. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was the professional exodus. Between 1970 and 1973, over 200,000 skilled workers left Chile. These weren't oligarchs fleeing with stolen wealth. They were doctors, teachers, engineers, small business owners. The exact people needed to rebuild the economy. They saw stage 3 arriving and made the rational choice. Leave before the borders close. When Pinochet's coup happened in September 1973, it wasn't the cause of economic collapse. It was the symptom. The system had already died. The patient was already gone. The coup was just someone finally admitting it out loud. And here's what should terrify you. Cuba is in stage 3 right now. The professionals are leaving. The borders are still open. And nobody in power is admitting what's coming. Let's jump forward. 1991, the Soviet Union collapses. For Cuba, this isn't just a geopolitical shift. It's an economic apocalypse. Overnight, Cuba loses $6 billion in annual subsidies. That's like losing 85% of your income on January 1st and still having to pay all your bills for the entire year. The Cuban government called it the special period in time of peace. Beautiful euphemism. What actually happened? GDP dropped 35% within 18 months. 35%. To put that in perspective, the Great Depression in America was a 25% GDP decline over 4 years. Cuba's collapse was worse than the Great Depression and happened faster. Food rations dropped to 1,000 calories per day. That's below UN starvation thresholds. The average Cuban lost 20 pounds during this special period, not through diet plans, through starvation. Hospitals ran out of basic medicine, antibiotics, painkillers, anesthesia. Surgeries were performed with rum as the only pain management. Transportation collapsed because there was no fuel. Buses stopped running. People walked 10 miles to work. The government imported 1 million bicycles from China because there was no gas for cars. Electricity was rationed to 4 hours per day, rolling blackouts. You never knew when power would be available. But here's what makes this case study absolutely critical for understanding today. Cuba had everything Venezuela and modern Cuba lack. They had highly educated workers, literacy rate over 95%. They had infrastructure built during the Soviet era, roads, hospitals, schools. They had functioning institutions. None of it mattered. When the external subsidy disappeared, the entire economic model imploded. And here's the hidden detail that mainstream historians don't emphasize because it destroys the narrative. Cuba survived only by abandoning socialist economics. In 1993, they legalized the US dollar. Cuban citizens could hold foreign currency for the first time in 30 years. They opened farmers markets with real prices, supply and demand, no government controls. They allowed limited private enterprise, tiny restaurants called paladares, family businesses. They let foreign investment enter tourism and opened the country to Canadian and European tourists. The socialism didn't save Cuba, capitalism did. Even if it was capitalism with a lowercase c, heavily restricted, tightly controlled. But it was markets, not planning, that pulled them back from total collapse. Here's the absolutely insane part. They never admitted it. The Cuban government called these reforms temporary measures during crisis. For 30 years, they insisted these were short-term compromises, not permanent policy changes. And for the last 30 years, they've been slowly walking back those reforms. Restricting private business, reimposing currency controls, returning to central planning. Cuba today has fewer economic freedoms than they had in 1995. They're literally regressing into the same trap that nearly killed them 3 decades ago. It's like surviving a heart attack, getting prescribed life-saving medication, then deciding to stop taking it because you feel fine now. That's where Cuba is, and the second heart attack is coming. You know this story, but let me show you the frame everyone missed. Venezuela in 2001 had the highest GDP per capita in South America. Higher than Chile, higher than Argentina, higher than Brazil. They had more proven oil reserves than Saudi Arabia, more oil underground than the entire Middle East combined. This wasn't a poor country that stayed poor. This was a wealthy country that chose poverty through policy. Hugo Chavez nationalized over 1,000 companies between 1999 and 2013. Oil companies, telecommunications, banking, steel, cement. Every time, the same pattern. Productivity collapsed immediately. Every time, the government blamed American sanctions or corporate sabotage, never their own policies. But here's what's fascinating from an economic perspective. The real breaking point wasn't oil prices crashing in 2014. That was just the trigger. The real structural problem was currency controls that created a parallel economy based on corruption. In 2003, Venezuela imposed strict currency controls. You couldn't exchange bolivars for dollars without government permission. The official exchange rate said $1 equals 6 bolivars. The black market rate said $1 equals 40 bolivars. That gap created opportunities for theft on a mind-boggling scale. If you were politically connected and could access dollars at the official rate, you'd exchange $100,000 for 600,000 bolivars officially. Then, you'd immediately sell those bolivars on the black market for 2.4 million bolivars. Instant 400% profit. Multiply that by billions of dollars. That's how you loot a country. By 2018, the gap between the official rate and the black market rate was 60,000 to 1. 60,000 to 1. The official exchange rate was pure fiction. The entire government became a rent-seeking cartel. Corruption wasn't a bug in the system. It was the entire point of the system. When oil prices dropped from $110 per barrel to $30 per barrel between 2014 and 2016, the scheme collapsed. Venezuela couldn't import food anymore. Government reserves evaporated. Shelves emptied. And here's where the math gets truly horrifying. Inflation hit 1 million percent in 2018. 1 million percent. That means if you had $1,000 in savings on January 1st, by December 31st, it was worth $1. Your entire life savings, your retirement, your emergency fund, reduced to pocket change in 12 months, every bolivar-denominated asset became worthless. Bonds, stocks, real estate. If it was priced in bolivars, it went to zero. 7 million Venezuelans fled between 2015 and 2023. That's 20% of the entire population. Gone. And here's the connection to Cuba that nobody's making. Those refugees went to Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, Chile, Brazil, Panama. Host countries absorbed them, barely. Their social services strained. Labor markets flooded. Housing prices spiked in border cities. Political tensions exploded. Right-wing populist movements gained power partly by running against Venezuelan immigration. Colombia alone spent over $4.7 billion dealing with the refugee crisis between 2015 and 2020. Not charity. These were mandatory costs for border security, temporary housing, healthcare, education for refugee children. And here's the truly insane part. Colombia is still spending this money. The crisis never ended. It just became normalized background noise. But that's not even the worst part. The worst part was what happened to Venezuela's economy post-collapse. By 2022, remittances from Venezuelans who fled and were sending money home hit $5 billion annually. That's more than the Venezuelan government collected in taxes. The country became economically dependent on money sent by people who left because the economy collapsed. The exodus became the economy. Let that sink in. The people who fled are now funding the people who stayed. The country is economically sustained by its own refugees, and Cuba is following this exact playbook right now, frame by frame, scene by scene. Let me map exactly where Cuba is on the scarcity spiral right now using specific, verifiable data points. This isn't speculation. This is documented current reality. Stage 3, the exodus. We are deep into it. In 2022 alone, over 300,000 Cubans left the island. That's 3% of the entire population in one calendar year. The fastest exodus rate since the Mariel boat lift in 1980, when 125,000 Cubans fled in 6 months. But unlike 1980, when people built rafts and floated across 90 miles of shark-infested ocean, today's exodus is more systematic. Cubans fly to Nicaragua because Nicaragua doesn't require entry visas for Cubans. From Managua, they travel overland through Honduras, Guatemala, and Mexico to reach the U.S. southern border. It's a 2,000-mile journey. And hundreds of thousands are making it. As of September 2024, over 530,000 Cubans have entered the United States since January 2021. That's 5% of Cuba's total population, gone in less than 4 years. To give you perspective on what that demographic shock means, imagine if 16 million Americans suddenly left the country. Entire cities emptied. That's the equivalent impact Cuba is experiencing right now, and it's accelerating. Cuban encounters at the U.S.-Mexico border hit 220,000 in fiscal year 2023 alone. But here's the smoking gun that tells you this isn't just economic migration, it's collapse. These aren't unskilled laborers. These are doctors, engineers, teachers, nurses, technicians, the exact people Cuba needs to maintain basic services. Cuban medical schools graduate 10,000 doctors per year. Cuba loses 8,000 medical professionals per year to emigration. You can't sustain a healthcare system when 80% of your new doctors leave immediately. Cuban hospitals are already operating with skeleton staffs. Emergency rooms have 2-hour wait times for heart attacks. In January 2024, Cuba's government announced they had only 4 months of foreign currency reserves remaining. 4 months. That's not a budget problem. That's a countdown timer to national bankruptcy. When those reserves hit zero, Cuba cannot import food, cannot import fuel, cannot import medicine. Complete economic shutdown. Now layer this critical piece on top. Cuba's primary economic partner for the last 2 decades has been Venezuela. Venezuelan oil shipments kept Cuba's lights on, but Venezuela is collapsing too. Venezuelan oil shipments to Cuba dropped 54% between 2022 and 2024. The subsidy that kept Cuba alive is evaporating. Cuba imported 90,000 barrels of oil per day from Venezuela in 2021. By 2024, that number fell to 41,000 barrels per day. Cuba needs 65,000 barrels per day just to maintain minimal electricity. They're already short. That's why blackouts are now routine, 8 to 12 hours per day without power in major cities. But here's what mainstream media is completely missing while they treat this as just another humanitarian crisis. The financial contagion that's already spreading through the Western Hemisphere's banking system. The remittance economy. Cubans living abroad, primarily in the United States and Spain, sent $3.7 billion back to Cuba in 2023. Let me repeat that number. $3.7 billion. That's more than Cuba earns from tourism, more than Cuba earns from exporting medical services. The Cuban economy is now dependent on money sent by people who fled the Cuban economy. But those remittances flow through Western Union, money transfer apps, and informal courier networks. Every dollar sent to Cuba represents dollar demand outside the official banking system. When Cuba inevitably runs out of dollars, they will do exactly what Venezuela did: freeze remittances, confiscate foreign currency accounts, impose exit taxes on anyone trying to leave. And when that happens, the second wave exodus begins. Right now, millions of Cubans are staying on the island specifically because they receive financial support from family abroad. When that support gets cut off by government decree, those people have zero reason to stay. The entire remaining productive population attempts to leave simultaneously. We're talking about a potential refugee wave of 2 to 3 million people over 6 months. The largest maritime migration crisis in Western Hemisphere history. The U.S. Coast Guard is already running crisis simulations for this exact scenario. Now let's talk about the financial domino effect, the $1.2 trillion figure I mentioned at the beginning. This isn't hyperbole, this is math. Cuban sovereign debt. Cuba currently owes approximately $10 billion in sovereign debt to foreign creditors. When Cuba defaults, which they will because they have no ability to repay, those losses hit banks throughout the Caribbean and Latin America. Jamaica's National Commercial Bank holds Cuban bonds. Dominican Republic's Banco Popular holds exposure. Trinidad and Tobago's Republic Bank has Cuban credit lines. These aren't tiny community banks. These are systemically important institutions in their respective countries. Chinese and Russian exposure. China holds over $6 billion in Cuban debt. Russia holds another $4 billion. When Cuba defaults, those losses don't vanish. They flow into the balance sheets of Chinese and Russian state banks, which then tighten lending globally to compensate. That credit contraction spreads. Caribbean banking contagion. Total estimated Caribbean banking sector exposure to Cuban debt, Cuban-backed corporate bonds, and trade finance credit is approximately $35 billion. When those assets go bad simultaneously, Caribbean banks need emergency capital injections or they fail. That triggers deposit withdrawals, bank runs. Credit freezes, tourism sector collapse. Cuba is the third largest tourist destination in the Caribbean after Mexico and Dominican Republic. Over 2.5 million visitors annually pre-COVID. When Cuba destabilizes completely, those tourists don't stay home. They go to other islands, Jamaica, Bahamas, Cayman Islands. You might think that's good for those countries. It's not. Their infrastructure cannot absorb sudden increases of 20 to 30% overnight. Hotels overbooked, beaches overcrowded. Environmental damage, service quality drops. And once a destination gets a reputation for being overcrowded, tourists stop coming entirely. The World Travel and Tourism Council estimates a Cuban collapse could reduce total Caribbean tourism revenue by $18 billion over 3 years. Remittance freeze secondary effects. When Cuba freezes remittances, $3.7 billion in annual money flows gets cut off. That money doesn't just evaporate, it gets redirected. Cubans in the U.S. who were sending money to family in Cuba will instead try to bring those family members out. That means more immigration applications, more asylum claims, more border crossings. U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement estimates absorption costs of $15 billion over 5 years, just for processing, housing, and integration. The narco connection. Here's the part nobody wants to say out loud because it sounds conspiratorial until you look at the evidence. When state authority collapses, cartels fill the vacuum. It happened in Venezuela. Colombian and Mexican cartels now use Venezuela as a transit hub for cocaine heading to Europe and the U.S. Venezuelan military officers take bribes to allow drug flights. Cuba is 90 miles from Florida. If the Cuban government loses territorial control, Mexican cartels will turn the island into a Caribbean distribution hub within 6 months. The DEA flagged this exact risk in congressional testimony in September 2024. Once that happens, cocaine and fentanyl flow through Cuba, drug violence spikes, and the U.S. faces a national security crisis 90 miles offshore. Interdiction costs, enforcement costs, healthcare costs from increased overdoses, estimated at $40 billion over 5 years. Add it all up. Cuban sovereign debt defaults, $10 billion. Caribbean banking exposure, $35 billion. Tourism disruption, $18 billion. Remittance freeze creating secondary crisis, $8 billion annually for multiple years. Refugee absorption costs across Latin America and the U.S. estimated $1 trillion over 10 years. Increased narco-trafficking costs, $40 billion over 5 years. Total, $1.2 trillion in economic damage across the Western Hemisphere. We're not watching disconnected events. We're watching dominoes already falling in slow motion. I know exactly what you're thinking right now. I can hear the objections forming. The U.S. embargo caused this, not socialism. Look, I'm not here to defend U.S. foreign policy. The embargo is real. It has effects. But let's be brutally honest about the math. Cuba trades freely with 190 countries. Every nation on earth except the United States. They import food from Vietnam, medicine from China and India, oil from Venezuela and Russia, machinery from Europe. If one country's embargo could destroy your entire economy, that says far more about your economic model than it does about the embargo. Vietnam faced a U.S. trade embargo until 1994. Identical situation. Today, Vietnam's GDP per capita is 4 times higher than Cuba's. Same embargo history, different economic choices, completely different outcomes. Vietnam opened 2 markets. Cuba didn't. Vietnam is now a manufacturing hub. Cuba manufactures almost nothing. But Cuba has universal health care and education. That counts for something. It absolutely does. Let's acknowledge that. Cuba's literacy rate is 99.8%, higher than the United States. Cuban doctors are genuinely well trained. But here's the uncomfortable question nobody wants to ask. What good is universal health care when hospitals have no medicine? What good is literacy when the economy cannot employ educated workers? Over 50% of Cuban university graduates work in jobs completely unrelated to their degrees because the economy can't absorb skilled labor. You have mechanical engineers driving tourist taxis because the taxi pays $30 a day in tips, while the engineering job pays $15 per month in worthless pesos. That's not a success story. That's a tragedy of wasted human potential. And other countries struggle economically. Why single out Cuba? Because Cuba is the ideological anchor for authoritarian socialism across Latin America. Nicaragua's Ortega, Bolivia's Arce, Venezuela's Maduro, they all point to Cuba as proof the model works. When Cuba finally collapses completely and admits the model failed, it removes the last intellectual cover for these regimes. More practically, because Cuba's geographic location, 90 miles from Florida, means its collapse creates an immediate U.S. national security and humanitarian crisis. This isn't an abstract debate about economic systems. This is millions of people attempting to cross 90 miles of ocean simultaneously. The Coast Guard cannot interdict that volume. Most will make it. Some will drown. It will be the largest loss of life migration event in modern history. That's why this matters. Not politics. Human lives and economic consequences spreading across an entire hemisphere. Here's the entire pattern in one sentence. Command economies collapse when they run out of other people's money, and the failure spreads to everyone economically connected to the failing state through debt, trade, and refugee flows. We're there. The countdown is running. So what do you actually do? First, if you have family in Cuba, help them prepare for remittance freezes now, not later. Between now and mid-2025, before currency controls tighten further, help them convert savings into tangible goods, non-perishable food, medicine, especially antibiotics and chronic disease medications, tools, anything with barter value. Cuban pesos will be worthless. Physical goods become currency. This is not theoretical. This is exactly what happened in Venezuela. Second, if you're an investor with Caribbean or Latin American exposure, audit your portfolio immediately. Look at emerging market bond funds, Caribbean real estate investment trusts, regional banking stocks, anything with Cuban debt exposure or high concentration in Caribbean tourism. These assets will take significant losses when the cascade starts. Reduce positions now while markets are still liquid. Third, if you're in a country that will receive Cuban refugees, United States, Mexico, Colombia, understand that social services will be strained. Not might be, will be. This isn't anti-immigrant sentiment. This is math. 7 million Venezuelans over 5 years, strained multiple national budgets. A similar wave from Cuba, and it will be similar, will do the same. There will be political tension, social tension, economic pressure on housing markets and labor markets. Understand it's coming. Fourth, watch remittance networks as your canary in the coal mine. When Cuba announces restrictions on Western Union transfers or starts confiscating foreign currency accounts, and they will, that's your 90-day warning. That's the signal stage 4 has begun. You will have maybe 3 months before full cascade. Fifth, track Nicaragua closely. Nicaragua is currently the release valve allowing Cubans to exit legally by flying to Managua, then walking north. If Nicaragua closes that route under pressure from Cuba's government or other regional powers, the exodus immediately shifts to boats. 90 miles of ocean, thousands attempting the crossing, Coast Guard rescues, deaths at sea. When you see the first major news cycle about boats, about rafts, about mass drownings, the implosion is happening in real time. Sixth, if you work in border security, immigration services, or refugee resettlement anywhere in the Americas, prepare for the largest humanitarian operation in modern Western Hemisphere history. We're talking about logistical challenges that dwarf anything since World War II. Start planning now, not when CNN is showing live footage of boats. The trigger is already pulled, the dominoes are falling, the only variable left is timing, and every indicator suggests we're measuring in months, not years. In part 2, dropping next week, I'm going to reveal the 3 Caribbean nations that collapse immediately after Cuba, the 1 Latin American country that actually profits from this crisis, and the specific asset class that becomes the new currency of the Caribbean when dollars disappear. I'll also show you the exact border crossing routes, the Coast Guard intercept maps, and the emergency protocols already in place that prove governments know this is coming, even if they're not telling you. Subscribe, turn on notifications, because when this breaks, it breaks fast. The information you need won't be on cable news until it's already too late to act. By the time Anderson Cooper is reporting from Havana, the opportunity to prepare will be gone. In every crisis, wealth isn't destroyed. It's transferred from those who didn't see it coming to those who did, from those who believed the comforting lies to those who accepted the uncomfortable truth. The exodus has begun. The financial contagion is spreading. The only question that matters now is this: are you paying attention?